Hello, my name is Laura Moore, and I am the VP of Programs for Apraxia Kids. This session is called CAS 101. I hope that these provide information to anyone who is new to the Apraxia diagnosis. So we're going to start out talking about language. And language is the grammar and vocabulary that makes up communication. And it's also the social use of words and sentences to communicate. So we have some rules that we have that guide us and how we can say things, when we can say things. So that social use of language, as well as the words that we use, the vocabulary, and then the grammatical construct of our sentences. The language is broken up into receptive language and expressive language. So what we understand of language, we hear or see. And then expressive language is how we communicate our thoughts, our ideas, our requests, usually through speech, but it can also be through sign language or gestures or through pictures. So all of that would be the expressive language. Speech is the use of sounds to form words and sentences for spoken language. You'll also hear this referred to as articulation. And then there's articulation disorder, which is having one or maybe a couple of speech sounds that are in error. So for instance, having a lisp on your S sound or other sounds, or having a distortion of R. So a child who says wabbit, but the rest of his speech is intelligible or is correct, then we would consider him to have an articulation disorder. A phonological disorder is having difficulty with the rule system that governs our language. So what sounds can go together and in what order, those kinds of rules that we have. So things like if you leave off the final sound in a word, it actually changes the meaning in English. So if we have the word bow, so it's a hair bow in our hair, or boat, with the T at the end of it is then something that floats on the water. So having that on the end of the word changes the meaning of it. Another example would be what sounds can go together. So at the beginning of the word, an S can be combined with certain sounds to form different words like stop, snake, sky. So there's an S plus another consonant. But there's some consonants that S isn't combined with in the English language. So SD doesn't usually go together, or SJ at the beginning of a word. So those rules are that help us form our words and use sounds correctly. And so that's the phonological part of language. And so a child who has difficulty with that, so they might like leave off the final sounds of words, or if the word is snake, then they might drop the N and just say sake. So errors like that are patterns. And so we consider that to be a phonological disorder. Some speech terms. So phoneme is a speech sound. It includes all consonants and vowels. So a vowel is a speech sound that's formed with usually an open mouth. And so there's not a constriction of the airflow coming out. In English, we have long and short vowel sounds for the letters A, E, I, O, and U. And then a diphthong is a sound that's formed by moving from one vowel to another vowel and conjoining it. So like the sound oi, like boy. So it's made up really of two vowels together, O and E, oi. And ow is made up of two different sounds, ah and ow, the at the end, ow. So that's a diphthong. And so it's just two vowels together. And then we have consonants. So a consonant is a speech sound that's formed by some kind of constriction within the mouth. And it's not a vowel, obviously. So we categorize all of our consonant sounds by how they're made. And so I've got some terms here for you. So a nasal sound is a sound where air is pushed out through the nose. So like and all of those the sound comes through our nose. A stop or a plosive, sometimes it's called, are sounds where the flow of air is stopped by one of our articulators. And so it can be stopped by the lips. And so that becomes pa and ba. It can be stopped by our tongue in the front. So that's t and d. Or in the back of the mouth on the palate, with the tongue k and g. So those sounds are made in the back. Affricative is a sound where the air is partially constricted by the tongue, so but air is still flowing like across the tongue. So s, z, sh, zh, the th sound and h sound. Or if it's stopped, if the air is constricted by the lips and teeth, like and ooh. And so we hear like a turbulent kind of sound with those fricatives. An affricate or affricative is a sound where the air is stopped and then pushed through a constriction. So it sounds sort of like a fricative, but the air is stopped and then it's released. So ch and j are the affricates. And then a glide is sounds where the air is shaped by articulators held close together, but the air is allowed to flow. So wa and ya. The y is ya sound, like yellow. And then the last one is liquids, where the sounds are made by the tongue getting close to the top of the mouth, but the air comes across the tongues or around it. So like, oh, your tongue is at the top of your mouth and the air comes around it. Or the air comes across the tongue. So if we think about what needs to happen in order to say the name of this picture, so I want you to say that out loud and think about what sounds are in that word that you're saying and what your mouth is doing to say each of those sounds. There's the picture. So what needs to happen for us to say the word can? So we have to think of the word. So the idea or the word is in our head, in our brain. And then we have to figure out what that word is. If we're going to make a sentence and say it's a can or a can, then what words go with it. Or if we're just saying can, then we have to figure out what sounds are in what order in order to say that word. And so the k is first, and then the a, and then the n, and they all form together. And so our brain then makes a plan for what sounds are being used to say that word. And then it programs what muscles need to move in order to do that. So the back of the tongue comes up for the k, and then it comes down for the a. For the n, the air's got to go through our nose. So there's a program that moves our muscles and our articulators to make that sound. To make that word. And so then the signal is sent for these muscles to move and the voice to turn on and the word comes out. And so then we hear the word can. So children who have apraxia have difficulty in that planning and programming stage of saying the word. So they know what the word is, they can come up with it, and their muscles can move to say it, but getting it from the brain to the mouth in the right order with the right sounds is where they have a difficult time. So we call that a motor speech disorder. So motor speech disorder is kind of an overarching term to mean difficulty anywhere within that planning, programming, or execution, actually moving our muscles for the movements needed for the speech sound production. So apraxia is a disorder where the planning and programming is disrupted. And then dysarthria is another disorder where the execution of the movements, there's actual muscle weakness. And so their ability to move those muscles to make those sounds is where the disorder is. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how do children learn speech and language skills. And so really it starts at birth with children listening to sounds. They hear the sounds and they focus on the sounds of the language that they hear every day. And then eventually they start trying to imitate it. They learn that those sounds have meaning, and then they try to imitate it. And so this is where we hear them playing with sounds. So we call it vocal play or babbling. And so they're making different sounds with their voice, and they don't have meaning. They're not really saying words, but they're playing with sounds. And this is a very important step in the development of speech and language. Over the first 12 months of life, they get better at making those sounds, having them come together to form a word. And then so when they first start really trying to say words that they're hearing, so one of the first words they say is mama or dada usually. And so when they do put those sounds together in the right way and that word comes out, then it is reinforced because we clap and we go, yay, you said a word, you said mama, you said dada. And so we really reinforce that. And so then the child goes, oh, well, I can do that again. And they repeat it. So by 12 months of age, they typically are using 3 to 5 consonants. So the first ones they start using are p, ba, and and they use a variety of different vowel sounds. And then they are easily able to repeat syllables like mama, 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 mama. So they're not really trying to say mama as a word to mean their mother. They're just playing with sounds and repeat syllables. But then, around 12 months of age, they do come out with a couple of words that they're using meaningfully. So mama, dada, ball, more, up. So they're using some simple words like that at around 12 months of age. By 18 months, they typically are using 4 to 6 different consonants. So they could add the sound, and wa. And then they're combining syllables into jargon. And so jargon is a kind of the next step in their vocal play that they do. And it sounds like they're having a conversation and they're combining a lot of different sounds. They have intonational patterns and it sounds like they're talking, but we just don't really hear words within there. So it's ma, ba, ba, da, ga, ba, boo. And so we hear those sounds and it sounds like they're telling us about something, but the real words aren't in there when they're doing that. But they will add more words between 12 and 18 months, up to about 20 words usually. Between 18 and 24 months, then they will add even more words. And by 2 years of age, usually have around 50 words that they're using consistently and meaningfully. And then they start combining words. And so they'll start saying 2 words together like go bye-bye, no, me, more juice. And they might not make all the speech sounds correct, but you can kind of tell what it is they're trying to say. They'll have 6 to 8 consonants, and so they'll add the t and the da at this point by the time they're 2. And then by the time they're 3 years of age, they'll start making sentences with some speech and language errors. So we'll hear speech sounds that aren't right. Well, the grammar won't be right, but they're making sentences. And generally, they're about 75% intelligible, which means we can understand about 75% of what they say. They'll have some words that we're not sure what they're saying, and we might guess at what they are. They will add the g, the f, and the ya to their inventory. During the next few years, new sounds are learned, and until they have all their sounds, their vocabulary grows daily, as well as the ability to form more grammatically correct sentences. And usually by the age of 7 or 8 years of age, they have mastered all of the sounds and they use them in their daily communication. We don't usually hear that many grammatical errors. We might hear some, but typically their sentences are pretty grammatically correct and sound like adults. Okay, so then what is CAS? So we already talked about it's a motor speech disorder. So it's a neurological disorder. The planning or programming of speech is disrupted. It affects about 1 in 1,000 children. And so that's about the same prevalence as we see children who have Down syndrome. It's 1 in 1,000. And children won't outgrow it. And so it's not something that we can take a wait and see approach and think that, oh, it'll get better with time. But, once they mature, it'll get better. And generally, if it is childhood apraxia speech, that won't happen. They won't outgrow it. So what is CAS not? So it is not a medical diagnosis because we don't have a brain test or a blood test that's going to definitively diagnose it. It's not a muscle weakness issue. Now, apraxia can coexist with muscle weakness or dysarthria, but the CAS part is not a muscle weakness. It's not a simple speech sound issue where isolated sounds are practiced until mastery, like an S or an R sound. And it's not a diagnosis that usually stands alone. Usually there's another disorder with it. It can be by itself. And I have seen a couple of kids who CAS was the only thing that they had. But typically there's some other things going on that we find. And so just to kind of reiterate what we've been talking about. So we have communication up here. And then we have speech, and then language is all part of communication. And then if we look under speech, we have voice, which is the voice that we use to speak with, fluency, which is how smoothly our language, our sentences are, and the flow of our speech. We have motor speech, which is what we've talked about, the programming and planning and execution of sounds. And then we have articulation. And so within this, we have CAS and dysarthria are part of the motor speech. And then on the other side with language, we have phonology, which is those rules of language I talked about, of sounds, rules of speech sounds. And we have grammar, we have vocabulary, and then we have the social use of language. So under the speech sound, this is where we're dealing with the CAS and dysarthria. So what causes CAS is often a question we hear. And so there's no empirical evidence of a specific neurological damage in the brain to support a cause for it. And so we've been able to do some functional MRI testing with kids with apraxia, and we don't see a damaged area of the brain in the language or speech center of the brain. There are multiple symptoms of CAS that seem to differ between kids. So not all kids with CAS will look and sound the same. And it rarely stands alone, like I mentioned. And so most of the time we don't know a specific cause of CAS in a child, which can be frustrating. But once it's identified, then we can provide treatment and do some things to help that child. We do know with some new research that's happening within genetics that there's several genes that have been identified as being causal for CAS, we think. So the FOXP2 gene is one that's been identified in numerous cases. And then in a more recent study, we've been able to identify 19 different genes, which are, we think, related to CAS. And these are, they're de novo. And so that means that they are new in the child. So they're not inherited from the mother or the father. So in the genetic studies, they do gene sequencing on the child, and then they do the mom and the dad. And the child will have a genetic marker that neither the mother or the father have. So it's not passed down from a parent. And we, through these studies, we believe that at least anyways, 1 out of 3 children have a genetic marker for CAS. So the other 2/3 of kids do not have a genetic marker that we've identified. So that gives us some information to help us with diagnosis, possibly earlier diagnosis with children to provide appropriate treatment. So that's very exciting. So what are some characteristics of CAS? So ASHA, which is our American Speech and Hearing Association for Speech Language Pathologists and Audiologists, they put together a committee of experts on CAS. And in 2007, they published a definition of CAS with some characteristics. And so the 3 main ones they identified were, one was inconsistent errors on productions of vowels and consonants. And so we find that our kids with CAS, they're not consistent in how they're saying their words. And it's just because they don't have that program and plan down for words. And so, you know, they might say ba for ball one time, and then the next time it might be boo, and then another time ma. And so it varies. And so that inconsistency is a hallmark of kids with CAS, whereas other speech sound disorders, we don't hear that inconsistency. They might not say the word correctly, but they say it incorrectly the same way every time. Difficulty with transitions between sounds or words. So again, that's that planning. And so being able to move from one sound to the next sound to the next sound smoothly is what gets disrupted because the planning and programming is not right for the word. And so the child might be trying to say can, but it comes out and. So there's a break in between the k and the rest of the word, or between two words, there might be a break. And so that transition and that movement of going from one sound to the next is disrupted. And then the other problem is prosody. So prosody refers to the intonational patterns or the melody of language. And so when we talk, we don't just talk all at one level, and we do not stress any word over another word. And so that sounds kind of robotic. And so without prosody, that makes our language more interesting. It gives us cues about what's happening. So if I'm going to ask a question, my prosody goes up at the end. So are you ready to go? And go. So that goes up. So having that prosody difference is what makes language more interesting, but also gives us cues as to the meaning of what we're saying. So children with apraxia have difficulty with that prosody because they're trying to focus on, what sounds they're saying and what order and what muscles need to move in order to move the articulators to make those sounds. Then so much concentration is on that, they have difficulty adding, in addition to that, any prosodic types of intonational patterns and raising our volume or changing the pitch of the words. So, and again, that's all in that planning that we do when we're talking. So this website is the website for the ASHA practice portal, which gives us our definition for apraxia that was done. So some additional characteristics that we see, one we've kind of talked about. So children with apraxia are very quiet as a baby. They have limited babbling. And so we don't hear them doing that vocal play and babbling that we hear in typically developing children. So they're characterized as being, oh, they were so good and quiet. Well, quiet isn't always good in this case anyways. They will have limited vowels, so they won't use a range of vowels, or they might be distorted. So in their speech or even in their vocal play, we don't hear very many different vowels. It's all what we call neutral vowels, or where there's not a lot of movement required in our jaw and our tongue to make those vowels, as opposed to some other vowels. We know that children with apraxia have at least average receptive language skills. So they understand everything, they know what they want to say, but the expressive part of it is where their deficit is. There's also information about children with apraxia, talked about that they lose words. And so what this means is that they might say a word one time and then not be able to say it again. And so we say they lose that word, or they had it as a pop-out word. So they might be, driving down the street with their mom, and they pass the McDonald's, and the child very clearly, tells his mom, McDonald's. And the mom's all excited because, oh, he said McDonald's, and that's a really hard word, but he said it and I understood it. It was very clear. Say it again, say it again. And then the child can't say it again and might not say it again for months. So that's what we mean when we say they might lose words. Automatic speech is better than volitional speech. So their ability to, tell their brother no about something just in the heat of the moment. But then when they're, when mom or the therapist is trying to get them to say no and say, here, imitate it. I'm going to say it, then you say it. No, you say it. And the child has a lot of difficulty, even though they were able to say it automatically at home with their mom, with their brother. And then groping, trial and error, and effortful speech. So we see groping, which is where they're moving their mouth, trying to find the right position for what they're saying. And so we might see, it looks like trial and error, like they're kind of trying to get their mouth or their tongue in the right place to do a sound. And they might try several different times before they get it right. And sometimes we'll just see these kids with apraxia really just have to work to get the words out. It can be very difficult sometimes for them to talk. Additional characteristics, poor intelligibility can be, so our ability to understand them can be anywhere from mild to very severe or poor. They're judged to be either to have mild, moderate, or severe apraxia. So mild would be they just have a little bit of difficulty in talking, versus severe where they are maybe nonverbal or only have a couple of words that they're able to say. They also will have very slow progress in speech therapy, especially if it's not the right type of therapy for apraxia, which you'll hear more about in part 3. But they will, even with appropriate therapy, their rate of progress might be more slow. And then children with apraxia are at high risk for reading, academic, and social challenges in school. And so that's why it's very important for these children to have early intervention, so that maybe some of these issues can be mitigated or reduced. What if my child is not saying many words? So, maybe they have a couple of words, or maybe they don't have any words yet. So how can we tell if they have apraxia? So we have some red flags that we see in very young children that from a study that was done in 2019. And so these things I'm going to talk about are things that might be seen in younger children, or before the age of 2. And so some of these would be limited vocalizations in the first 2 years of life. So again, that quiet baby, so that would be like a red flag. So if the child is very quiet during their first year or 2 and not doing that vocal play and babbling. Lack of a consonant by 12 months of age. So, we talked about that by 12 months, they should have, 3 to 5 consonants. So if they don't have any by 12 months of age, that's a red flag. If they use fewer than 3 consonants by 16 months of age, or fewer than 5 consonants by 2 years of age, then those are both red flags. So we can kind of track how many sounds they're using and what those sounds are, can give us a clue as to what they're doing. And this can just be sounds in their play, not really saying words. Limited to no velar production, so those sounds that are made in the back of the mouth, so k and ga. So if they're not using those 2 sounds, then that's a concern, even in their vocal play. And they usually will, children with apraxia will favor those stops and nasals, so the p, ba, d, da, t, and n. So they'll use those consonants, but not any others that are even early developing sounds. And then productions at 13 to 18 months are largely vowels, and they don't use other syllable shapes. So syllable shape is usually a consonant and a vowel together, although a vowel by itself can be a syllable. But so, if the child is going, ah, but not putting a consonant with it. So, not saying go. So a consonant and a vowel together is a syllable shape, or a vowel consonant like up. So those 2 shapes are putting a consonant vowel consonant together, like the word can, so consonant vowel consonant, or putting consonant vowel, so like mama or dada. So you're using different syllable shapes. If they're not doing those kinds of things, then that's a red flag for having apraxia. A child that I worked with, when he was 3, the only sound he would do was and he would go and carry on this whole dialogue with just saying and using some prosody, so and tell us things, but of course we couldn't understand anything. So just having that one syllable shape was all he used pretty much for everything. Does CAS co-occur with other disorders? So the answer is yes. So I'm going to talk about some difficulties that are common with our children with apraxia. So one is having difficulty with moving their oral musculature. And so oral apraxia is the difficulty moving their their mouth for non-speech sounds. And so things are just non-speech movements, really. So smiling, making a kissy face, sticking their tongue out. So those kinds of things, if they have difficulty doing those when they're imitating or they're asked to do those things, then that would be oral apraxia. And they could have that with the apraxia of speech. Dysphagia just means difficulty with skills for eating. So chewing something up, moving it to the back of the mouth, and then swallowing it. So those phases that we go through for eating, if they have difficulty with that, then that's dysphagia. And then drooling, sometimes our kids have difficulty controlling their saliva. And so, past the age of teething and their teeth erupting, then when drooling typically happens. But then if it persists beyond that age, then it could be due to not being aware that it's there or being aware that they need to swallow. Or it could be due to muscle weakness. And so they're not the inability to actually keep their saliva in their mouth and swallow it. There's also other motor disorders that might happen. So gross motor refers to large motor movements. So like running, throwing a ball, riding a bike, climbing stairs, those kinds of big movements are gross motor movements that could have difficulty with. And then fine motor movements are the small motor movements, such as stacking blocks on top of each other, holding a pen or pencil with the correct grip instead of just grasping it and coloring like that. Being able to use the pincer grasp and do that as they get older. Using a fork or spoon might be difficult. Cutting with a knife, those kinds of movements are fine motor movements, and so they could be delayed in any of these movements. So they might develop just a little bit, takes a longer time to develop versus a typically developing child. Literacy is a term that just refers to reading and writing. And so our kids are at high risk for having reading difficulties. So we typically look at, in young children, their phonological awareness skills. And so these are pre-literacy skills that children, usually between the ages of 3 and 5 years of age, are learning, and it helps prepare them for reading. So skills such as rhyming words, sound identification. So what's the first sound in this word? Sound blending. So being able to put sounds together like we do when we're reading. If we can do it orally, if we have the words that makes can, and putting them together. Counting syllables. We all remember counting syllables in a word. That can be difficult for our kiddos. And then sound letter association. What sound does the letter B make? It says ba. Putting those together. So often we should be working on these skills with our kiddos with apraxia while we're working on speech sound productions. And so that will be talked about later as well in the third part. And just to note that, for a child who is, 5, 6, 7 years of age, who their speech is difficult to understand, it's hard to really assess their reading skills. You have to look at it differently in order to assess their reading skills when they're trying to read out loud and they're saying a word and you don't know if they're really reading that word or if they're making words up because it doesn't sound like the word is. So that's just an extra challenge that we have. Autism. So not all children with autism have CAS, and not all children with CAS have autism, but they can co-occur. But it's difficult to determine if a child who has autism is not speaking due to a motor planning disorder, or if there's something else going on, or if it's because of the autism. So it takes more time to do a diagnosis and determine if it's a motor planning disorder with autism or something else going on. Sensory processing disorder. So sensory processing is just how we take in information from our senses. So what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, what we feel, where our body is in space. All of our senses are all responsible for bringing in that information, sending it to our brain, and then our brain has to process it and make determinations on it. if you need to react. So like if you touch something that's too hot, then your brain immediately tells your hand to pull back, so we react to it. So, we might hear sounds that we ignore because they don't really pay attention. We don't need to pay attention to them, like the air conditioner clicking on. We don't pay attention to it unless it's making a really weird sound. Then we're like, what? And then we pay attention to it. So, our brain's ability to process all that information, and we're getting information all the time from our senses. So even if you're sitting in a chair watching this, you're visually, you're seeing the screen of the PowerPoint, you're hearing me talking, you can feel the chair underneath you that you're sitting on. You feel the air conditioner come on, you hear the air conditioner come on. So all of that sensory information is coming in. And so your ability to, okay, I need to pay attention to what I'm hearing because I'm learning things, and I don't need to pay attention to the air conditioner. So, our brain makes those decisions. So a child with sensory processing disorder isn't able to process the information and respond appropriately. And so things that we see from our kids who have sensory processing disorder include some of these things I've listed. So they might just appear clumsy and uncoordinated. They might bump into things, even walking down the hallway, they bump off the wall maybe. They might try to sit in a chair and miss, or they fall out of their chair. They either overreact or underreact to stimuli. So, loud sounds might be like painful, or really bright lights might hurt their eyes. A light touch, touching on their arm lightly might feel painful to them. Or, they might, put their hand in water and not realize if it's hot or cold water. They might not get dizzy if they're twirling around. So those are underreactions to stimuli. They might have difficulty handling change, which can be a characteristic of children with autism. And children with autism are known to have sensory processing disorders. And so not able to handle transitions from one thing to another or changes in the routine. It might be a sensory processing disorder. It might not mean they have autism. So we have to just determine, what all the symptoms are telling us. They might have frequent meltdowns or tantrums for a reason we don't know, but to them, something happened. They got overstimulated, too many people in the room, or too much talking or whatever, and it causes them to have meltdowns. It might be something as simple as, tags in the back of their clothing are very irritating. And so that's what's causing them to have a meltdown, or maybe, take off all their clothes because they bother them because of the touch thing. So sensory processing disorder is something that we have seen in children with CAS, and just that processing of information. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some different acronyms that we use. We have a lot of acronyms we use for terms in our field. So I'm going to try to go through some of these with you guys. So EI is early intervention. And so these are services that are provided to children from birth to 3 years of age or 5 years of age, depending on the state, who meet criteria. So they could get services for occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then if you're in early intervention, then you have an IFSP, or your child does. So that just means an individualized family service plan. And so this is a plan that's made up of the team involved with your child, and you are a member of the team as a parent. And so the services that your child has, how often those services are, what the goals are for those services, are all in this plan that is made for your child. If you're in a school district or your child's school age, then you would have an IEP, or an individualized education plan. And this is, again, a plan that's made with the team involved with your child within the school district. It's done every year, but it can be done more often than that. But all the objectives the child's working on for everyone who's seeing that child, so it could be academic kinds of objectives, speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, all those, anything that the child is doing as part of this plan. And it says, how many minutes the child receives services, who's doing that service, providing that service, what the goals are, and all of those types of details are in the IEP. In Texas and a few other states, they refer to an ARD meeting, so admission, review, dismissal meeting. And so this is just the meeting where the IEP is developed. So sometimes you might hear that term depending on where you live, or it will just be called the IEP meeting. AAC is stands for Augmentative Alternative Communication. And so this is the use of some other communication modality besides oral speech to communicate. And so it can include sign language, using pictures, gestures, a high-tech device that gives voice output for communication. So depending on the child and his needs, if he's not able to communicate functionally, so he doesn't have a way to talk about things or to request things, to answer questions, then having an AAC device or alternate modality or method of communicating could be very important. It could reduce frustration. It could just give the child a means to communicate until speech comes in. So we work on speech at the same time, but then we have this alternate way for him to communicate until his speech is improved enough where people can understand him. The AAC device will absolutely not slow down the development of his speech, and oftentimes it helps it and supports it and improves their language skills. So it's a win-win. OT, PT, and ST. So OT is occupational therapy, or it can mean an occupational therapist who provides treatment for difficulties with those small muscle or fine motor skills and for sensory processing. A physical therapy or physical therapist for PT provides treatment for difficulties with large muscle movements or gross motor skills. And then ST is for speech therapy, which deals with the communication disorders and dysphagia and feeding kinds of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about SLPs and our training. So a speech language pathologist or SLP is someone who has their master's degree in communication sciences and disorders or speech language pathology. You'll also hear them referred to as a speech therapist or a speech language therapist. And then CF is a clinical fellow. So that's a designation given to an SLP who is in the first 9 months. The first 9 months of their employment after graduate school. So they're required to do an internship and still be under the supervision of a certified speech language pathologist. And so those people designate after their name SLP-CF for clinical fellow. So they've got the master's degree, they've already graduated, they're just doing an internship as part of their certification tract. And then ASHA, I talked about the American Speech Language and Hearing Association, which is our governing association for speech language pathologists and audiologists in the United States. Okay, so CCC and SLPA. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our certificate. So we, as a speech language pathologist, we get our certificate of clinical competence. And we do this by having a master's degree in communication disorders or speech language pathology. We have to pass a national exam, and we have to complete a Okay, so the certificate of clinical competence. So for speech language pathologists, we have to have a master's degree in communication disorders or speech language pathology. We have to pass a national exam, and we have to complete a 9-month internship under a mentor. And so once we complete all 3 of those things, then we can get our certification. So it's also called our Cs, the 3 Cs, the Certificate of Clinical Competence, so CCC. And that's designation is written after our name and our degree. And so we'll put CCC-SLP, which you see there on the slide. And so that would be someone who's certified and functioning completely independently. And then a speech language pathology assistant, or SLP-A, is a therapist who has a bachelor's level of training, and they can do therapy, but they work under the direction of a certified SLP. And they're not allowed to do evaluation, so they have some restrictions on what they're able to do, but they can carry out a treatment plan under their supervisor. There we go. Okay, state licensure. So many states additionally require a license to practice in that state, and requirements differ from state to state, but generally they follow what ASHA requires for a therapist, but sometimes there's some differences. And then some states also have a license for an assistant in speech language pathology. In Canada, they also have a license. It varies from province to province. So after their names, they will have initials to indicate their degree, their master's degree that they have, and that varies depending on what university they're from. And then they'll have a SLP after their name for speech language pathologist, and that means they've completed their master's degree and they're licensed by their province to provide assessment and treatment. And so, each province differs. In addition, they might have a C in parentheses after their name, and that just means they're a certified member of the Speech Language and Audiology Canada organization, or the SAC organization. So how can I find an appropriate therapist? So there's a couple of resources, and these are both listed in the references or the resources at the end of the PowerPoint, or the end of your handout. So the Apraxia Kids website has an SLP directory for both United States and Canada, and you search by your state, city, or zip code, or your province if you're in Canada, and you can find an SLP that hopefully is close to you that has some knowledge, some basic knowledge of assessment and treatment for apraxia. And so SLPs in our directory have passed a quiz on apraxia, and they've completed several short answer questions as well, so that we know that they have a foundational knowledge of apraxia to be listed on our directory. And then the Child Apraxia Treatment SLP directory contains SLPs who have attended intensive training on assessment and the use of the dynamic temporal tactile cueing treatment protocol by Dr. Edie Strand, which you'll hear more about in the third part of this series. So now I'm going to talk about some questions that you can ask a therapist to see if they have training. So maybe you find a therapist who isn't in our directory, but you wanted to know if they have experience and knowledge about CAS before you start having your child see them. So these are some questions to ask. So one would be, what type of training do you have in childhood motor speech disorders, and how did you obtain it? Did you attend an Apraxia Kids conference? Did you read articles? Did you do some other kind of training on apraxia? So just asking, where their training came from. Most graduate programs for SLP don't have a lot of information on CAS. They might touch on it, but they don't go in depth into really how to treat and how to assess it. What is CAS and how is it different from other speech sound disorders? So the answer to that question should be there's a difference in what CAS is and how to treat it, and how to what you do differently, or how CAS differs from an articulation disorder or a phonological disorder. If they say it's all the same and you treat them the same, you need to not see that therapist. What experience do you have evaluating and diagnosing CAS? So just, asking, how many kids have they diagnosed with CAS? It's a rare disorder. So most therapists in a school or a private practice haven't seen just 100 kids with CAS, but hopefully they've had some experience, and you want to know that. And then tell me about your assessment process for CAS. What should I expect when I bring my child for an assessment? And so, what tests do they use? How do they differentiate CAS from another speech sound disorder? And the second part of this training will let you know what answers to expect for that. And then what experience do you have treating CAS? How many kids have you treated? What were the age ranges and severity? And do they match what your child is showing? If your child has a fairly moderate to severe CAS, then you want someone to treat them who has some experience with that type of child. And then what were the outcomes for the children with CAS that they've treated? How much progress did they make? And, where did they end up? And what is your approach to treatment for a child with CAS? So they should be able to give you some specific examples of what they do in therapy and why they do it. And it's okay to ask why they do things. So the third part of this will help you with, what would be appropriate answers for that question as well. And then if your child is using AAC or you think your child might need AAC, then asking the therapist what experience they have with that. And then importantly, it's important to ask how they include parents in their therapeutic process. Are you allowed to watch the therapy, sit in on a therapy? Do they expect that you will practice with your child at home, and how much that is and what that might look like? It's important because you are a big part of the treatment process for your child. So where can I find more information about CAS? So we have a lot of information on our website. Just to let you know a couple of things. We've got a webinar platform that has some webinars that are free, but also has additional webinars. And then that you can watch on a variety of topics. We have an article library that gives a lot of good information on different topics within about CAS, about education, about therapy, about diagnosing, all kinds of different articles. And then we have a virtual education series that has some webinars on a variety of topics. And so we've got information for school-based therapists. We've got information about comorbidity, treatment, bilingual therapy, homeschooling, advocacy. Some of the webinars are more for professionals, and some are more for parents, and some are for both. And so it says on there, who is the best audience for each of those webinars that are on there that you can see. We also have resource guides. And so we've got several different ones. So we have a state-by-state guide. So you can look up your state or your state, and it'll tell you information in a bunch of different categories for your state. Then we have an IEP resource guide. So if your child is in school and you're dealing with IEPs, it has a lot of good information on it. There's a summer camp guide. There's a book list for CAS. It includes books for parents, books for professionals, as well as children's books about CAS, about having to go to speech therapy, having a speech sound disorder. So there's some good books on there. There's a homeschooling guide, and then there's a guide for different apps for both Apple and Android for children for practicing speech sounds and words, as well as for using the device as a communication tool, an AAC device. We also have downloadables and brochures that are available. So there's things that you can download and send to his teacher, his therapist, things that you can take to the school and give out at an ARD meetings. And so there's a lot of good information there. We also have a speech tablet program. So if your child does need an AAC device, we have an opportunity for parents to apply to receive an iPad for free. And then we also have support in the way of social media, Facebook pages. We have an official support group that is large, has lots of people on it, and both family members and professionals who are asking and answering questions. And then there's also smaller, more localized state groups or regional groups. Even within a city, there's groups for as a place to go to get support and ask questions and get responses. So here are my resources. And so the two websites, Child Apraxia Treatment is there, our main Apraxia Kids website, and the ASHA website is on there as well. So thank you very much for listening.